All right, so hi everyone. My name is Vinayak Gajjewar. I am a fourth-year computer science major doing research under Dr. Ahmed Eldawi. And today I'll be presenting my research presentation called Implementing a Distributed Evapotranspiration Model. And thank you all for coming. It's an honor to share what I've been working on recently. And I really hope that you find it interesting and compelling. So first, I'll give some background into my research. So my project is concerned with quantifying this process called evapotranspiration. And it's a really complicated sounding name, but really it's just two processes combined together, evaporation and transpiration. Evaporation is when water is lost from the ground via energy from the sun, and transpiration is when water is lost from leaves of plants via photosynthesis. And this is really essential to the Earth's water cycle, and also it influences local ecosystems, the climate, as well as local weather patterns. So we can compute this using satellite data so that when farmers and water managers know how much water is being lost via evapotranspiration for a given land tract, they can make better decisions about irrigation and water management, etc. And one question you might have is, why should we compute this via satellite data as opposed to just going out into the field and actually measuring it? That's because sometimes it's more feasible than actually measuring it via sensors, such as when you want to compute evapotranspiration for remote locations or when the cost of sensors becomes too prohibitive. And this is a really big deal, especially because we're all, in California right now, and other drought-affected areas can really benefit from quantifying evapotranspiration because we want to know where our water is going. So now I'll talk about the motivation behind my project and as well as the objectives. So like I mentioned, it's really vital to be able to quantify water consumption because there are lots of applications in agriculture, hydrology, as well as climate modeling. But the issue is that existing computational models that exist just do not scale well to large quantities of satellite data. Like previous models can take entire days to compute evapotranspiration for a tiny, tiny little tract of land. So the main objective for my project is really to create a scalable data model for computing evapotranspiration. And by scalable, what I mean is that it should be able to handle large quantities of satellite data. And that's really what makes this project different, is we want to be able to process satellite data in parallel to reduce the time it takes to perform these really complicated computations. And so now I'll move on to an outline of my research methods. I am using a big data programming framework called Apache Spark to code my mathematical models. And we're basically combining weather data with soil data, with atmospheric data, performing these computations, and then comparing that to actual sensor readings from the sensor called a lysimeter to determine accuracy. And a lysimeter is basically just a sensor that determines evapotranspiration. It looks like a big old barrel or bucket that you can place out in the field, and it'll measure evapotranspiration. And so the data sets that I use for this project come primarily from NARR, which stands for the North American Regional Reanalysis dataset. And from there, the things that I get are air temperature, wind speed, solar radiation, and air pressure. And this data has really, really fine spatial resolution, up to 3 meters per pixel. And so when you're looking at a large tract of land, you can imagine that's a lot of data. So there's definitely a need to be able to perform computations efficiently as opposed to sequentially. And the temporal resolution of this data goes from anywhere from 8 to 32 days. And the reason that the time steps are so large is because that's literally the amount of time it takes for a satellite to orbit the Earth, anywhere from 8 to 32 days, which is why our time step is that large. And so to evaluate the accuracy of our model, we're using localized data from Yuma, Arizona, which is a city near the Colorado River Basin. And I'm working with data from that region because we have a lot of super accurate lysimeter readings for cropland in that area. So it's really easy for us to evaluate accuracy that way. And this picture on the right shows a subset of the NARR data that I'm using. So, it spans the contiguous US. So you can imagine that the data that we're working with is really quite large. And so this is a graphical overview of my code. So the first thing we do is clip the data to only the area that we're interested in, because we don't need to waste computing processes for like the contiguous US when we're only interested in one small subsection of it, because that's a waste of resources. And then we need to decide which standard to use when translating pixel values to actual latitude, longitude values. So we need to rescale all the satellite data files that we're using to the same CRS, which stands for Coordinate Reference System. And then from there, what I do is my model iteratively computes evapotranspiration for each 1 hour chunk of time, and then writes it to the local file system. And so my code uses the system called RDPro to work with satellite data in an efficient manner. And what RDPro does is it represents satellite data in code as multi-dimensional pixel arrays. And one really important thing that we're doing is chunking data into tiles, which are just smaller blocks of pixels. And this is really important because we can perform computations on individual tiles as opposed to the entire data file. Chunking data into tiles lets us spread out the computation across computers, which is something that existing systems like Google Earth Engine or GeoTrellis don't do. And because of that, they suffer from these limitations, such as running out of memory or having too time-consuming of a data loading step. And on the right here, you can see my diagram, which represents a tile in satellite data. And so this is an overview of the data flow using RDPro. So you first read satellite data from disk and chunk it up into tiles. And these tiles can vary in size, but for my project, we're using 2000 pixels by 2000 pixels. Next, you perform the computations that we want to perform, and that requires shuffling tiles back and forth, and then writing the output back into the file system. And so that was an overview of RDPro. So now let's look at my model. What I do first is load the satellite data from disk, reproject it to a common reference system. In my case, that's this standard called EPSG 4326. And then I perform tile-wise computations for each time step, write the output data back to the local file system, and then compare the results to the measured evapotranspiration in Yuma, Arizona. And as you can see in the diagram on the right, there are a lot of intermediate computations that need to be performed to be able to compute evapotranspiration. And so my model currently is able to compute reference evapotranspiration. And what that means is that's evapotranspiration that makes a lot of assumptions for a hypothetical grass reference crop. And these assumptions are that the crop is well watered, it resembles grass, and it's not undergoing any soil water stress conditions or anything like that. And that's not really indicative of reality, because in reality, there are a lot of fluctuating variables like soil water stress conditions and whatnot. And a couple of challenges that I faced while working with my research was that I found that it's really difficult to rescale and reproject data from a lot of different sources, because I'm pulling these satellite images from a lot of different sources, and it can be a pretty big headache to make sure that they're all compatible with each other. Otherwise, the computations just don't work. And so eventually what we want to be able to do is produce a reading of evapotranspiration like this figure on the right, which is taken from evapotranspiration data in Kansas. And we also want to be able to plot it visually on a map, which I'll explain in the next slide. So this is an example of gridded output data, also from a study area in Kansas. On the top left, it's kind of small, but you can see evapotranspiration being plotted. On the top right is irrigation. And on the bottom left, we have something called NDVI, which stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And what NDVI is basically a metric for evaluating the health and density of plant growth, and it's measured using the difference between red light and near infrared light reflected by vegetation. And on the bottom right is LAI, leaf area index, which describes plant canopy structure. And so this research is really important because it can help farmers make informed decisions on irrigation and conserving water, because water conservation has far-reaching effects. And studying evapotranspiration is really at the core of agriculture and water management. There are a lot of improvements that can be made to this model, such as factoring in how evapotranspiration changes in soil water stress conditions, as well as non-pristine vegetation and non-growing periods. So there's definitely a lot of work that still needs to be done. I'd like to acknowledge, before I end off this presentation, I'd like to acknowledge everyone who helped make this presentation possible. My faculty mentor, Dr. Amal Dawi, my PhD student, Dr. Zhu Cheng, Dr. Elias Cudiero, and as well as everyone who made the research symposium possible. This research was funded by the undergraduate mini grant, as well as by the USDA and the NIFA.